I'm Sara Cohan. I'm the Education Director of the Genocide Education Project. The other panelist here is Roxanne McCostian. She is the Executive Director of the Genocide Education Project, and she'll be helping to collect the questions from Q&A and chat for me to answer at the end. Because this is a fairly quick presentation, I'm going to wait till the end to take questions. So again, for those of you just joining, thank you all so much for being here today. This is a really significant time for us, as not just as Armenians, but as people concerned about human rights across the world. And so with no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started on my presentation. Today's presentation, it's on the occasion of the 106th commemoration of the Armenian Genocide. As most of you, and this is a bit US centric, I think most of our participants are from the US, and if not, I apologize. But this is from kind of a US centric perspective in a way. But this has been, as many of us have said, an unimaginable year. But for so many groups, it's also been an unimaginable lifetime and an unimaginable history. So for many of us, the events of the year have only been a continuation of things that we've already known to exist and occur, not just in our lifetimes, but in the lifetimes of our ancestors. This week in particular, we've all been anxious, waiting for words of judgment. I took a quote from the New Yorker this week, and I thought it was not just appropriate for the trial for George Floyd's murder, but also in many ways for us as Armenians and for other groups. And it reads, after Derek Chauvin was convicted of George Floyd's murder, people hugged and wept. But it was not a joyful scene. It was something else. It was only justice for a moment. Currently, only 1% of killings by police in the United States have resulted in criminal charges. We could even look back. In 1964, perpetrators laughed. This particular image is, you might remember, from Mississippi burning, of Price and Rainey at their arraignment, laughing at the idea that they could be convicted for the killing of civil rights workers. Today, these same people lead insurrections, they pass Jim Crow era laws, and they continue to kill. Today was the funeral of the last victim of Minnesota. Today, as Armenians, we hold our breath, waiting for Biden's call. It is not the first time we've held our breath waiting. Oftentimes on April 24th, if you talk to an Armenian, they'll be anxiously hitting the refresh button of their computer, wondering if this year the president will recognize our history. In 2019, the Congress recognized our pain. But the question is, will Biden? If Biden does, much like Floyd's, the verdict for Floyd's murderer, it will not be a joyful scene. It will be something else, a small step towards justice 106 years too late. This image is of my family in 1918. It is the only remaining members of my grandfather's family after the genocide. And this is what I mean by 106 years too late. So now we're going to look at the Armenian Genocide, and we're going to think about it today, not only in context of the particular history and pain that it has caused Armenians, but in terms of a larger human rights perspective. What the Armenian Genocide represents for non-Armenians is the ongoing battle for justice and recognition that so many groups have yet to see. And we'll start with the idea that we as Armenians, we're more than victims. We used to inhabit a large expanse of land from the Mediterranean to Black to Caspian Sea. Today, we only have a small portion of that land, landlocked and surrounded by enemies. Before the genocide, we were great inventors. We created one of the first wineries in human history. We were astronomers, creating visions of the universe. We were artists and artisans. We were leaders. We were religious. We were the first group to adopt Christianity and 301 CE. We created an independent alphabet in order to write and express our Christian faith. We are a people with a land, but not a state. We've lived under occupying forces for much of our existence, and only in brief periods have we known the satisfaction of living under independent rule. Armenians today have a state of their own. We are modern, we are sophisticated. You can't discern this scene in Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, from most cities, major cities throughout the world. But for how long will that last? Aliyev, the dictator of Azerbaijan, this week has threatened to take yet another piece of Armenian land by force, quote, whether Armenia wants it or not. We are facing in this year the ongoing existential threat of losing what's left of our homeland completely. And this scene, it is a park that was just built called Trophies Park, in which, and that's again Aliyev walking through it, where Armenian soldiers are created, scenes are created of Armenian soldiers, and their images bring to mind that of the characterization of Jews during the Holocaust. Aliyev walks through an aisle lined with the helmets of Armenian men who had fallen in war against Azerbaijan. So how did we get here? Again, Armenians were used to living under occupied forces, but under the Ottoman era, things became very, very different. Life in the Ottoman Empire reflected one of second-class citizenship for Armenians. They were taxed higher rates, they had restricted legal rights and limits on property. In the late 1800s, Armenians were fed up. They saw themselves as part of the Ottoman Empire and worked firmly to see that discriminatory laws were taken off the books. They sought reform and wanted to exist as equal partners with Turks within the Ottoman state. This desire for equal access under the law led to horrendous massacres that foreshadowed the genocide to come. In the mid-1890s, approximately 200,000 Armenians were massacred, and all started because of their desire for equal rights. After the massacres, there was a moment in which Armenians, Turks, Jews, Assyrians, and Greeks gathered together in Paris in 1902 to try to create a constitutional government. This great liberal experiment was known as, was titled the Young Turks. This group was known as the Young Turks. But by 1908, this hope disappeared. Extreme nationalism seized the Young Turks, and Turkification became more important than working with minority groups. So when faced with the idea of sharing power, Turkic majority revoked the rights of those who had participated in the Young Turks and created a concept again of Turkification, which meant Turkey only for the Turks. By 1909, supporters of Sultan Hamid carried out an unpunished massacre in Adana in which 30,000 Armenians were killed and the city nearly destroyed. And here you can see in this pan-Turkic ideal that the idea was that not only would the Turks in Turkey band together against non-Turkic groups like Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, Jews, and later Kurds, but that this spanned across territory in which Turkic people lived. Everything was heightened once the Balkans were lost as the Ottoman Empire crumbled. In losing the Balkans, the Turks brought back immigrants from Turkish immigrants from these lands. These people needed housing, they needed jobs, and Turkey was short on resources. So in 1914, the Ottoman Empire is known as the sick man of Europe. It's crumbling and falling apart, and it turns on its minorities that have supported its rule for so many centuries. And it's at that moment, that crisis in which you have economic disparity, economic crisis, interred hatred of your non-Turkic minorities, and then the beginning of World War I, which was a perfect cover, that you have the beginning of the Armenian Genocide. And if we can look at the Convention on the Prevention for Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, we can see that killing members of the group, causing serious bodily and mental harm, deliberately inflicting on group conditions that are calculated to bring out its physical destruction in whole or part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, all coincide with the things you're about to hear that happened during the Armenian case. The perpetrators of the Armenian Genocide were Enver, Talat, and Jamal. It was a triumvirate. They led Turkey to pass the temporary law of deportation, which gave provincial governors the right to arrest Armenians on false pretext and deport all Armenians from Turkey. Also, law was enacted, the Abandoned Properties Law, which gave the Turkish state the right to take Armenian wealth. On April 24th, 1915, almost exactly 106 years ago, Armenian leaders were arrested and assassinated. Government orders were issued across the provinces for local governors to round up and either execute or imprison Armenian leaders. Here's an image of some of the Armenian leaders who were hanged shortly after April 24th. This is the last possible image of my great-grandfather, Hagop Ayvazyan. He lived in the town of Talas. He was a physician's assistant at an American hospital. But when these orders were issued, like all Armenian able-bodied men, he was rounded up and executed. And then the deportations began. Armenian women, children, and the elderly were forced to leave their home without food, without any preparation, and sent into the deserts to walk to Syria. My great-grandmother was on that walk. She was able to secure places for my grandfather and his siblings that were temporary, but at least allowed them not to end up on the march. On the march, people died of exposure, they died of starvation, and they died by attacks from militia groups that were mainly composed of Kurdish criminals that were unleashed from prison and ordered to attack Armenians as they caravan through the desert. And here we can see the routes that Armenians took, that were forced to take into Syria. If they survived the march, they rarely survived the concentration camps that awaited them in Deir el-Zor. Many were witness to this. One of the most significant witnesses was Henry Morgenthau, who was the US ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And he stated, "In the whole history of the human race contains no such horrible episode as this." Other witnesses include missionaries, humanitarian aid workers, including the American Red Cross and Near East Relief, an American-based organization, German soldiers, businessmen, and foreign government representatives. The world knew about this event. The New York Times ran 149 articles in 1915 alone, documenting the tragedies facing the Armenian people. The Near East Relief Committee, which was formerly known as the American Committee for Relief in the Near East, campaigned and raised $30 million to send aid to Armenians. Towards the end of the war, an independent Armenia was briefly brought into existence. My great uncle was one of the first government officials of the First Republic of Armenia. The Turkish, there were also at this time a Turkish military tribunal, and Talat, Enver, Jamal, and Nazim Bey were all found guilty and sentenced to death. Yet these were not carried out. They were able to escape and were only tracked down by the amazing work of Armenian groups and brought to justice on their own, much like Mossad, led by the Israelis. The Treaty of Sèvres in August of 1920, the hope was that this treaty would help to affirm and recognize the free state for Armenia and keep them safe, what was left of them safe. But by 1923, the Treaty of Sèvres was discarded and Lausanne was put in its place, which had much more preference towards Turkey. Armenia lost its statehood and fell into the hold of the Soviet Russia. So the final chapter for Armenians in their homeland between 1918 and 1923, most Armenians in the Ottoman Empire had perished. That was approximately 1.5 million of 3 million. Survivors were forced to leave. A 3,000-year-old civilization ceased to exist. Currently, and since this time and currently, acts of denial by the Turkish government have been swift and hateful. Acts of denial include anti-free speech laws in Turkey, threats against foreign governments, which we can see in the news today as Biden considers acknowledging the Armenian Genocide this week, violence against survivors and descendants, revision of history, and the destruction of ancient Armenian buildings. We have to remember denial is aggressive. It continues the process of genocide. It strives to reshape history in order to rehabilitate perpetrators and demonize the victims. And in this image, we have Hrant Dink, who was shot down in the street for simply writing his thoughts and ideas about ethnic Armenians within Turkey in his lifetime. Denial is personal. I've already showed you the picture of my family. This is a picture in the center of me and my grandfather, who is a survivor, who I grew up with very closely. And the bottom image is a burned out section of the Armenian Community Center in San Francisco. It was burned, the entire center was burned down to the ground this year, and it included our offices and much of our work. It's under federal investigation today. Genocide is a reality. And as long as denial continues, the crime of genocide continues. It affects not just those at the time of the massacres, but it continues to hurt generations of the victims. and in its continuation is the intent to destroy the group. Today, according to an Armenian expert, Tasjan, today the gates of Vienna are open in front of Erdogan. There is no front to contain Erdogan's ambitions and the revival of the Army of Islam. Erdogan has made it clear in the past year that he intends, quote, on finishing the work of his grandfathers. We are in great need for justice, even 106 years after the initial act of genocide itself, because today we are still facing the threat of genocide because of ongoing denial and lack of acknowledgement. So again, that was the heart of my presentation. If you would like more information about our organization, you can go to our website at genocideeducation.org. We recently put out a new lesson plan on the stages of genocide, which will help teachers connect the issues of the Armenian case to other cases of genocide around the world. Well, I want to just again thank everyone for joining us and listening in. And if I could leave like just with one more thought, kind of what I kind of stated in the beginning is that the particular history of the Armenian case is incredibly important to remember, but it's also so important today to use our history to shed light on injustices occurring to all sorts of groups today. And that can be one of the best ways that I think we can remember those who perished in 1915. Thank you.